The F-35 fighter jet is the most expensive weapons program in American history. $1.7 trillion, more than 2,000 aircraft. The backbone of American air superiority for the next 50 years. And right now, in 2026, the United States cannot build enough of them. Not because of a factory problem, not because of an engineering problem, not because of a funding problem, because of a minerals problem, specifically because of a Canadian minerals problem, because the nickel and cobalt and rare earth elements that go into every single F-35, 900 pounds of them per aircraft, flow primarily from Canadian mines. And the trade war that Donald Trump launched against Canada has set in motion a mineral redirect that is moving those resources away from American supply chains and toward Germany, Japan, and Korea on 15 and 25-year contracts that cannot be reversed by any executive order, any tariff announcement, or any social media post. The most advanced fighter jet ever built is being held hostage by a trade policy that was supposed to make America stronger, and the man who holds the receipt for that policy isn't in Beijing. He's in Ottawa, and he just signed 30 new mineral agreements worth $12.1 billion, with everyone except the United States. Mark Carney did not hold a press conference to announce this. He did not give a speech. He did not tweet. He flew to Berlin. He flew to Tokyo. He flew to Seoul. He signed agreements with the kind of quiet, deliberate efficiency of a man who understands that the most powerful moves in any confrontation are the ones that are already irreversible before the other side realizes they have happened. By the time Washington understood what was being built, the architecture was already load-bearing. 30 new partnerships, 12 allied nations, $12.1 billion, flowing to Canada's lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth deposits, away from the American supply chains that the Pentagon has spent decades assuming were secure, not because of any Canadian aggression, because of the systematic destruction of the partnership through which those resources were previously shared, by the same president who is now demanding to know why Canada won't cooperate. To understand the full weight of what is happening, you need to understand a number that the Pentagon has been trying not to say out loud. The United States is dependent on foreign sources for more than 95% of the rare earth elements that its weapon systems require to function, not China alone. Though China controls 70% of global rare earth processing and has been systematically tightening its export controls, foreign sources broadly, allies included, partners included, Canada included, the GAO estimated in 2025 that fixing the critical mineral gaps in American defense supply chains would cost $18.5 billion and take a decade. That is not a future problem. The 2027 deadline under the National Defense Authorization Act, which prohibits the use of Chinese origin materials in American weapon systems, is less than 12 months away. America does not have 12 months' worth of alternatives ready. What it had was Canada. What it is losing. Contract by contract, partnership by partnership, 15-year supply agreement by 25-year supply agreement. Is the assumption that Canadian minerals would always be available on terms that American industrial planning could rely upon? The assumption was reasonable. For decades, it was correct. Canada and the United States shared the most integrated economic relationship in the history of any two nations. 60 years of automotive supply chain integration, 40 years of energy interdependence, the longest undefended border on Earth. Two militaries so deeply intertwined through NORAD and NATO that the question of who defends whom had become largely academic. In that context, the assumption that Canadian minerals would flow to American defense supply chains as a matter of allied partnership was not naive. It was the institutional foundation of North American security architecture. Trump's trade war did not crack that foundation. It detonated it, and the detonation was not silent. It was a 50% blanket tariff. It was annexation rhetoric aimed at a G7 democracy. It was a president standing in the Rose Garden and telling Canada's Prime Minister that Canada lives because of the United States. And the institutional foundation which had been built over 60 years of genuine partnership cracked. Not because Canada wanted it to crack, but because the assumptions that held it together had been publicly, deliberately, and repeatedly violated. Carney came to office knowing this was coming before most people in Washington understood that it was possible. He had spent 15 years inside the architecture of global financial systems. The Bank of Canada through the 2008 crisis, the Bank of England through Brexit. Watching from the inside how institutions that look permanent become fragile, and how fragile institutions collapse when the assumptions that underpin them are systematically attacked. He had watched the 2008 financial crisis unfold because too many institutions had built their risk models on the assumption that certain relationships were permanent. He had watched Brexit cause economic disruption because too many businesses had built their supply chains on the assumption that certain agreements were irreversible. He was not going to watch Canada's mineral security get destroyed by the assumption that American partnership was eternal. So he began building the alternative before the detonation arrived. The question was not whether America would weaponize the trade relationship. The question was whether Canada would be ready when it did. The answer arrived on March 2, 2026. 30 new critical mineral partnerships, 12 allied nations, $12.1 billion in committed supply agreements covering lithium, nickel, cobalt, aluminum, and rare earth elements. This followed the October 2025 round of $6.4 billion in agreements with 9 countries. Canada and Germany had signed a joint declaration on critical minerals in August 2025 when Chancellor Merz met Carney in Berlin. A declaration that both governments described as a generational partnership, not a commercial arrangement. The Canada-EU Joint Declaration established a formal framework for European access to Canadian mineral resources. Japan and South Korea signed bilateral supply agreements backed by the kind of institutional commitment that their own governments have described as strategic. And each of those agreements is a supply flow that is no longer available to the United States at the terms and volumes that American defense planning has historically assumed. The minerals did not disappear. They are still under Canadian soil, exactly where they have always been. What changed is the allocation. Who gets the supply, under what terms, and with what priority? And Canada is allocating with precision. Institutional partners who signed long-term agreements at market rates get priority. Partners who imposed punitive tariffs and demanded compliance through the language of subordination get whatever remains. On January 14, 2026, Trump signed an executive order invoking Section 232 National Security Authority to address critical mineral supply chain vulnerabilities. The order was designed to strengthen American supply chain security, but it arrived in Ottawa at the worst possible moment. After months of tariff escalation, after the annexation rhetoric, after Canada lives because of the United States. And it was received not as an invitation to partnership, but as confirmation of exactly the dynamic that Carney had spent 12 months building alternatives to escape. The order contained a 180-day deadline, July 13, 2026, by which negotiations must produce results. That deadline sits 2 weeks after the USMCA review deadline of July 1st. 2 clocks running simultaneously. 2 deadlines converging on the same bilateral relationship. And the bilateral relationship is being managed on the Canadian side by a former central bank governor who has never once in his career missed a deadline that mattered. Carney's response to the executive order was not a counter-order. It was not a press conference. It was the activation of the partnerships that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Canada designated critical minerals as a national security priority under the Defense Production Act, the same legal authority that allows Canada to direct domestic resource allocation in the national interest. The formal diplomatic message was delivered with the flat precision that has become Carney's signature. Canadian resources are governed by Canadian law, developed under Canadian sovereignty, and will be allocated according to Canadian national interests as determined by the Canadian government. No foreign executive order alters this reality. The phrase that ended the communication was 2 words: full stop. In diplomatic language, that is a door being closed, not slammed, closed, quietly, firmly, and with the unmistakable finality of someone who has already built the room on the other side of it. Warren Buffett was asked about the minerals confrontation at a Berkshire Hathaway investors briefing. He removed his glasses. He cleaned them slowly. The veteran Berkshire watchers in the room recognized the signal. "There is a category of strategic error," he said, "that I have watched destroy companies that should have survived. It is the error of treating a supplier as a subordinate, of assuming that because you are the larger party, because you are the buyer rather than the seller, because your balance sheet is bigger, that the relationship will absorb whatever behavior you choose to exhibit toward it. It won't. Relationships have load-bearing capacity. Push past it, and the structure fails." He paused. Canada was not a vendor. It was a partner. The distinction between those 2 things is the distinction between a resource that prioritizes your access in a crisis and a resource that does not. America just learned that distinction. The tuition was $18.5 billion in mineral gap costs and a decade of supply chain reconstruction. That is an expensive lesson. It was also an entirely avoidable one. Then Buffett delivered the assessment that cuts through all the diplomatic theater to the structural reality underneath. The most dangerous supply chain is the one you assumed was secure because of a relationship rather than because of a contract. Relationships can be damaged. Contracts are harder to damage. They have legal weight, institutional commitment, and mutual economic interest on both sides. What Canada has spent 12 months building with Germany, Japan, Korea, and the European Union are contracts. What America had with Canada was a relationship, and the relationship was damaged. So now America is competing for contractual access to resources it once received through partnership. That is a more expensive, less reliable, and strategically weaker position, and it was entirely avoidable. On Berkshire's own positioning, we follow the leverage, not the volume. Canadian resource companies, European companies partnered with Canada, Asian manufacturers with Canadian supply agreements. These positions reflect where the economic leverage actually resides. The standoff will resolve. Every standoff resolves. And when it does, the resolution will favor the side with leverage. It always does. The defense industrial implications are not abstract. They are operational and they are immediate. The Governey analysis identified over 80,000 individual parts across American defense systems that depend on minerals now subject to foreign export controls or supply reallocation. The F-35 program requires 900 pounds of rare earth materials per aircraft. The Virginia-class submarine program requires 9,000 pounds per vessel. Every Arleigh Burke destroyer, every Tomahawk missile, every precision-guided munition depends on mineral inputs that cannot be sourced domestically at scale and cannot be sourced from China after 2027. The window between those two constraints, domestic unavailability and Chinese prohibition, is exactly the space that Canadian minerals were supposed to fill. That space is now being filled by supply agreements with Germany and Japan and Korea and the European Union. Not because Canada chose to exclude America, because America chose to destroy the partnership through which the inclusion was guaranteed. There is a dimension of this story that receives almost no attention, but may prove to be its most consequential long-term feature. Every mining nation in Africa, every lithium producer in South America, every cobalt exporter watching the U.S.-Canada trade war is drawing the same conclusion. The United States will weaponize trade relationships with its closest allies when it perceives an advantage in doing so. If it will do this to Canada, the country that shares the longest undefended border on Earth with America, the country that has fought alongside America in every major conflict since the First World War, it will do this to anyone, and the rational response to that conclusion for any nation with the resources that America needs is to build the alternative partnerships and alternative market access that makes American demand optional rather than essential. Canada built those alternatives. It took 12 months, and it created the template that every resource-holding nation on Earth is now studying. In Parliament, speaking first in French, Carney said the quiet part out loud with the controlled precision that has defined every major statement of his political career. Canada's resources belong to Canadians. They will be allocated according to Canadian national interests, Canadian governance standards, and Canadian strategic priorities. We are a sovereign nation. Our minerals are not American property, subject to American allocation decisions. They are Canadian assets that we will deploy in service of Canadian and allied interests on terms that we determine in partnerships that we choose. Conservative opposition leaders who disagree with Carney on virtually every domestic policy question issued statements of support within the hour. 85% of Canadians told pollsters they support Canada's mineral resource management strategy. That is not a partisan position. That is a national consensus. And national consensuses in democracies are harder to move than any executive order. The July 1st, 2026 USMCA review deadline approaches with the minerals confrontation unresolved and the bilateral damage accumulating. 17 million North American jobs depend on the integrated trade flows that the USMCA governs. American defense programs worth hundreds of billions of dollars depend on mineral supply chains that Canada is in the process of permanently reallocating, and the man across the table from Washington is not a politician calculating his next election. He is the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. The man who cut interest rates months before the Federal Reserve understood the 2008 crisis was coming. The man who kept the British financial system functioning the morning after Brexit when currency traders were in full panic. The man who told the World Economic Forum in Davos that the old order was not a transition, but a rupture, and received a standing ovation while the President of the United States was threatening him by name. Every major move Carney has made in this trade war was prepared months in advance. The mineral partnerships were negotiated before the tariff escalation peaked. The alternative frameworks were built before the executive orders arrived. The institutional architecture was load-bearing before Washington understood it existed. That is not reaction, that is preparation. And there is a reason the Canadian dollar went up when it should have gone down. Buffett closed his Berkshire briefing assessment with the observation that will outlast every tariff rate and every diplomatic communique in this confrontation. I have spent 70 years watching governments make decisions they will later wish they had made differently. The most consistent pattern I have observed is this. The party that destroys a working relationship always underestimates how long it takes to rebuild one. They assume that when they decide they want the relationship back, the other side will be waiting. The other side is not waiting. The other side used the time to build something else. Canada used the time to build something else. 30 new mineral partnerships, $12 billion in committed supply agreements, a defense procurement strategy that reduces dependency on American weapon systems, a domestic trade architecture that eliminated internal economic friction. The Canada that existed before this trade war. The Canada that sent 75% of its exports south and had no mineral partnerships of institutional weight. That Canada is gone. What replaced it is a Canada with contracts. And a Canada with contracts is a different negotiating partner than a Canada with only a relationship. That is not a threat. That is arithmetic. The F-35s still need their 900 pounds of rare earth elements. The Virginia-class submarines still need their 9,000 pounds. The 80,000 defense system components still depend on minerals now subject to reallocation. The 2027 deadline still stands, and Canada, which holds the geological reserves and the governance standards and the institutional reliability to be the solution to every one of those vulnerabilities, is in the process of signing those resources into partnerships with the allies who maintain the relationships that the trade war attacked. Trump launched the trade war to make America stronger. The minerals confrontation is the measure of how that strategy has performed. 30 new Canadian partnerships worth $12.1 billion with Germany, with Japan, with Korea, with the European Union, with 12 allied nations that honored their partnerships and received Canada's resources in return. The United States is not on that list, not because Canada excluded it, because the trade war made exclusion the rational response. Canada has the minerals. Canada has the contracts. Canada has the leverage. Trump said Canada lives because of the United States. The mineral agreements say otherwise. The rest, as any central banker will tell you, is just arithmetic running its course.